Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure and an honor to be here this evening. I want to thank Sunish and his team. Sunish, where are you? Sunish is there. Sunish Abraham and his team, who started off the Indusforum, that's the Indo-US Forum, as it were, and who've kindly invited me to be the first distinguished speaker for Indusforum. And it's a particular pleasure to be here in Houston, which I've only visited once before, and that was for a weekend at somebody's home in one of the suburbs where there was actually a board meeting taking place, and I was an invited guest. So I actually never got to see Houston then. I just landed at the airport, went to the suburb, was at his home, meeting finished, back to the airport, off. So this time I've had the great pleasure of seeing a bit of Houston, and I'm very pleased to have done so. I'd also like to thank very much Kiran Patil and his members of his committee at GISO for cooperating, of course, with Indusforum in bringing me here. And I'd like very much also to thank Mr. Sesh Bala, who is kindly hosting Sunish and myself during our time here, and his friends and family, and of course, members of the Foundation of Indian Studies, and their committee members who are also sitting here in front. Great pleasure to have all of you here, gracing and honoring this occasion. Now, it could be that many of us here don't have a real or objective interest in this topic for its own sake, but may have more of a functional interest in the topic as a result of concern for jobs. And that's okay. I will make some remarks in relation to that. If I forget, please remind me. And apart from the question of jobs, I guess there are two areas to cover. The first area is the global economy on the one hand, and of course India and Indians on the other. So let's start with the global economy. Now, I think some of you at least will know, and all of you should know, that pre-World War I, if you look at global history, America is nowhere in global history, obviously, for a very long time, centuries, in comparison to India or China or the Middle East, whether it's Iraq and what is today Iraq and Iran, or whether it's what is today Egypt. These are ancient civilizations. America is obviously nowhere in comparison to those. And if you look at the global economy from about 1870 onwards, which is really when the modern economy begins, then you see that America is more or less at the same level as France, Germany, etc., and then gradually rises and takes off. And by sort of 1890, 1900, it has become the #1 economy in the world, which is quite interesting. And that position as the #1 economy in the world gets consolidated through World War II, because, of course, as you know, during World War I and World War II, Europe is essentially destroyed by bombs and war. And nothing much is left in Europe. And it's essentially America which has really had only one attack on it, which is of course Pearl Harbor, which was destructive and horrible, I know, but nothing compared to World War I and World War II in Europe. America finances the recovery of the world at the end of World War II. It basically pays for the reconstruction of Germany, it pays for the reconstruction of Japan, it pays for the reconstruction of Korea at the end of the Korean War, and really finances the global growth at the end of the Second World War. So we could say that post-World War II economic growth took place because, of course, there was demand. I mean, there was no supply in Europe, and everybody was longing for everything from bread to machines to whatever. So there was huge demand and there was no supply inside Europe, but of course there was supply coming from America, but there was no cash to pay for these supplies. So America finances Europe and finances Japan and Korea and so on, for them to begin to buy American products, which of course enables American economy to do even better after World War II. Not just as having consolidated its position as the #1 economy, but really becomes the dominant economy. And this is of course the age of the almighty dollar. From about 1970, there is further growth taking place in the world economy, essentially because America de-links the dollar from gold, which is of course a very key thing that happens. And the reason it's key is because if you've read elementary economics, you will know that any currency connected to any particular product or thing like gold or silver, is going to find it very difficult to manipulate the value of its currency, because the value of its currency is objectively verifiable depending on how much gold or silver there is behind it. But if there's no gold or silver behind it, then of course you can manipulate the value of that currency much more. You can print as much money as you want. You can change interest rates and so on and so forth. This is a bad thing and a good thing. What's the good thing? The good thing is that as a result of manipulating the value of your money, you can increase economic growth. What is the bad thing? The bad thing is that you're now dependent not on objective things, however limiting those might be. Those are objective things. You're now limited to the cleverness of your central bankers and their advisors. And you're limited, of course, to how much faith you as ordinary citizens have in that currency. So it's a good thing and a bad thing, and essentially it's been managed basically very well. Of course, there are times when human beings fail and get things wrong, but essentially it's been managed very well. So that manipulation of the currency enables the American economy to continue growing. Other countries say, hey, if America can play this game, so can we. And so other countries start manipulating the value of their currencies too, which enables them naturally to grow faster as well. But as I've indicated, this faster growth is at the cost of greater volatility. Because of course human beings may not get things completely wrong, but they may get timing a little wrong from time to time. And in economics, those small mistakes have enormously multiplied effects. From the 1980s, we find saturation beginning to take place in the developed parts of the world. And there is less demand because, of course, everybody begins to have a house. Everybody, I don't mean everybody really, but everybody with money begins to have a house. Everybody begins to have their cars. Everybody begins to have their fridges and their washing machines and so on and so forth. So demand starts drying up. Natural demand starts drying up. And this is, of course, when the advertising industry really gets going. Not that it hasn't got going before this, but this is when the advertising industry really gets going. And as a result of really getting going, produces what is artificial demand, if you see what I mean. Not natural demand, but artificial demand. This is where brands started being built up. So you can now pay, I don't know, $1,000 if you like for a pair of shoes, instead of what the real cost of manufacturing that pair of shoes is, which may be $20 or $30 at most. Why? Because you're paying for the brand, right? So brands start becoming much more important in the 80s. And of course, our friends in the monetarist world, our monetarist economists, start persuading governments to put in place particular mechanisms in order to make demand much more effective, which they are, of course, quite successful with as well. From the 1990s, something very different happens. The Berlin Wall falls, the Soviet Empire basically collapses, China is released from its particular ideological orientation, and of course, India in the 1990s, China is end of the 80s, India is end of the 90s, so let's say the 90s. China and India are released from their socialist kind of orientation and tendencies, and the result of that is that something of the order of 2.5 billion people enter the global economy in a way that they have not done before. They enter as consumers, of course, they enter as producers, and it's absolutely clear that the natural impact of that is going to be enormous global growth. And that's what happens. And as that growth comes in, you know what happens to people when they're successful. They think this is great, the party is going well, let's have an even greater party. And so various ways were found of boosting growth even further. Many of these ways were unsound and dangerous, as we've discovered, of course, since 2007. Not that we did not know this before, but we have faced the consequences of these unsound and dangerous ways of trying to grow the economy. Because the economy, as we've designed it at present, goes through booms and busts anyway, and the greater the growth, the greater the booms, and therefore the greater the busts. So with these new mechanisms, the bust, when it came, as everybody knew it was going to come, was one of the biggest. And that is, of course, what happened in 2007, first in terms of the financial services industry, and then starting in 2008 in the real economy. Because one of the things that happened as a result of these new what I call unsound ways of growing, was that there came about a bifurcation in the economy between the financial services economy and the real economy. And that's why there was this huge gap between the crisis in the financial services economy and the real economy. So the crisis started in 2007. We are now 5 years into this crisis, and in my view, we are not out of the woods yet, not by a very long shot. In spite of the US alone having pumped in US dollars 2.3 trillion in an attempt to stabilize the situation. Now, the situation was indeed stabilized, but that is all that happened, and the economy is throwing out of its system slowly one of the high growth hormones which had been injected into the global economy, which is called leverage. And leverage is simply the amount of money you're allowed to borrow for every dollar that you put into a business or venture or asset. For example, a house. Do you have to put in 100% of the capital to buy the house, in which case the leverage is 0? Or do you have to put in 50%, in which case the leverage is 50%? Or do you put in 20%, in which case the leverage is 80%, and so on? Now, a certain amount of leverage is obviously very good in business because it enables you to grow your business faster. You have a small amount of capital, you can borrow a certain amount of capital against it or connected with it, and that, of course, enables you to grow your business. That's great. But too much leverage is bad because every loan needs to be serviced. Interest on it needs to be paid. And if you cannot service your loan, you can go bankrupt. And whatever assets your business may have are going to be seized and sold off. So whenever business is booming, you can probably pay the interest, and if you're lucky, you may, without too much difficulty, even pay off a part of the principal that's involved. But you have to have something in reserve to be able to cope with the problems if there's a slow patch. Now, actually in 2007, the slowdown was not because business had slowed down. It was because of another high growth hormone which had been injected into the global economy, which is actually speculation. Speculation is simply a rather elegant word for gambling. We had made gambling much more possible. It had been possible, obviously, for ages in global economic history. But starting in 1999, we had made it legal to gamble not just with the money of rather rich people or institutions with a huge amount of money who were willing and able to take extra risks, but we had made it possible from 1999 onwards even to gamble with the money of ordinary people like you and I, with the savings accounts that you and I have in banks and so on, with the money that banks have in the savings accounts that you and I put. We had also made it possible for this gambling to take place with money from, for example, municipalities, pension funds, things that before that had been forbidden from this kind of gambling, were allowed to be, money from this kind of source was allowed to be used for global gambling from 1999 onwards. So this speculation, huge amount of money going into speculative gambling activities, obviously increased as long as things are going well. As long as you're winning, that's great. You can keep putting more money and keep getting greater profits, wonderful. But of course, you know what happens with gambling. As long as you've got a winning streak, that's fine. But winning streaks don't last forever. So in 2007, when the oil price had gone to an unprecedented and totally unjustified level of roughly $140, you remember, people who'd been holding down 2 and 3 jobs in order to pay the interest on mortgages that were so large they should never have had them anyway, another high growth hormone which had been injected particularly into the US economy, then of course these people were not able to pay the premiums, the monthly deposits that they had to pay, monthly installments they had to pay, and as a result of that, another high growth hormone that we had injected into the particularly US economy, but really the global economy, which is called securitization, came apart as well. So all these high growth hormones which had done us so wonderfully in the period starting around 1980 suddenly began to come a cropper, began to go awry, go wrong. As a result of this, these and other factors such as NAFTA and WTO, NAFTA is of course a North American Free Trade Organization, and WTO is of course a World Trade Organization, the crash became the second worst crash in history, though federal actions did soften the blow. Now, attempts to get at the source of this disease, these kind of high-growth hormones, what I've called high-growth hormones, to get at these high-growth hormones and try and kind of tame these, to get the economy back on some kind of sound and sensible level, these attempts have so far produced mixed results. For example, in the United States, the Dodd-Frank Act, as it's called, after two legislators, Dodd and Frank, who pioneered this bill, which is not a perfect bill by any means. Any political bill is going to be some kind of compromise, isn't it? So no bill is going to be perfect. And you and I can punch holes in it till the cows come home. But the fact of the matter is, it was an attempt to get at the roots of the problem. And however inadequate it is, that attempt has been stymied, has been rendered inoperable because of the USA's political bickering and gridlock. So we have no fundamental solution. We have no solution for the fundamental problems that have faced the global economy and the US economy. So far. Maybe in the next 6 months, 10 months, 12 months, we will have a solution, in which case, obviously, the economy will start looking up again. But we'll have to see how that goes. In the meantime, Europe has its own problems as a result of the current global crisis, to the extent that Americans and American-educated economists doubted whether the euro, the currency of the European Union, like the dollar is of the United States, they doubted whether the euro would even survive. Now, those who know Europe a bit better can tell you that the euro will survive very well, because Europe, unlike the United States, completely different philosophy, different cultures, different backgrounds. Euro will survive very well because Europe likes to move slowly and steadily with as few rapid reversals as possible. But Europe, in spite of the recent turn up in manufacturing figures in the periphery areas, which some of you may have read about in the last week, is not going to provide an engine for global growth, because 17 million Europeans are currently unemployed, the highest number in a very long time, and those figures are from Monday. Well, what about the next biggest country, or most important country, which is actually Japan? Following its own real estate crisis in the 1980s, though it has held steady since then, it hasn't really recovered properly, and therefore will not provide an engine for global growth either. And if it does provide an engine for global growth, as I have argued in articles on the Japanese robotics industry, the kind of global growth it provides will not be the kind of global growth that is good for the globe in terms other than economics. In other words, in terms of society and politics, it will be a very dangerous growth, because a robot-driven global economy will mean even greater unemployment than we have around the globe at present. In Japanese, robotics, as you know, is number one. So if there is a huge takeoff in robotics around the world, I mean, not the kind of robotics we saw in the 80s, The kind of robotics we saw in the 80s was blue-collar robotics, replacing blue-collar workers in, for example, car factories. Now, that kind of robotics is history. It still is there, but it's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the latest generation of robots, and the latest generation of robots are extremely intelligent robots. 5 years ago, I was at the exhibition in Aichi in Japan. 5 years ago, I was at the exhibition in Japan, and I was utterly stunned. The person at the ticket kiosk, the person who was selling me, I was actually a guest, so it was not selling me the ticket, but making sure I got my complimentary ticket. I discovered with a shock, on feeling quite uneasy facing this woman, I discovered with a shock was not a woman at all, but was a robot. Could speak and look like a woman, very beautiful woman. Could speak 4 languages, could joke with you, could ask you how the weather was, could ask you where you wanted to go, could give you directions where you wanted to go. Seemed to be breathing. And the only reason I could tell that it was a robot was because when I looked at this woman's eyes, something was wrong. And you know what was wrong was the pupils, the inside bit of the eye, the pupil changes depending on what you're talking about and the light and the shade, and it wasn't changing. And I saw robots there that can change their own shapes depending on what kind of aperture they have to go through. Obviously, you know, robots fly planes. Robots are playing baseball. There were robots doing operations. There was a stadium about 10 times this, maybe 12, 15 times, I don't know, huge football stadium in which a little group of robots wheeled themselves into the central area. All of us were sitting around, and they proceeded to play a piece of classical music which was specially written for this orchestra. I could get my face copied, as it were, painted, drawn by a robot in cartoon form. So it's not just those grunk jobs that we're talking about. These are robots that can speak languages. These are robots that can instruct you. There were teacher robots teaching kids, playing with kids and teaching them, downloading the latest information from satellite-based information systems and giving them the latest information, unlike many of our teachers that are there in schools and even in universities, sadly, today. So this fourth generation of robots, if it comes into play, is going to eliminate not blue-collar workers, but white-collar workers. Some of you may remember Deep Blue. Do you remember what Deep Blue was? When was it? 1984, was it? 1980 something. Deep Blue was a computer that beat the world grandmaster at chess. Do you remember that? So this whole robot-driven economy will be great. It'll be huge. It'll be adding to productivity around the world. Wonderful. But the question is, who will own the robots? Because the guys who own the robots are the guys who are going to make the money. And so if the money generation shrinks from the present 1% who dominate, obviously, the global economy, as you know, to less than 1%, maybe to 0.1%, or to 0.5%, or to 0.001%, I don't know. Is that good for the global economy or not so good for the global economy? You tell me. Obviously, robots will generate more jobs of different sorts, but the point is the kind of people we will need to employ in a robot-driven economy will not be idiots. They will need to be cleverer than robots in order to justify employing them, or they will need to know how to use these robots more intelligently than they can use them themselves, than the robots can use themselves, or they will have to be people who design robots. We don't even need people to repair robots anymore because robots now repair themselves. So much for Japan. I could go much more into that, read my articles on robotics and the social and political implications of a robot-driven global economy if you're interested. My website, I think, is quite easy to find. If you got my name there, you can see Prabhu Guptara. Just do prabhu@guptara.net and you'll find my website very easily, or look for Prabhu Guptara anyway. It's a unique name, so you'll find me very quickly. So when I talked about Japan, some of you were probably thinking, China. What about China? You probably saw that China's growth rate has plummeted from 12% at the height of the boom to a projected 7.5%, according to President Hu a few weeks ago. Now, you know that China needs a growth rate of 8% to be able to absorb the millions of people it sends into the labor market every year. So if President Hu is right, this is the first year that China will not be able to employ its new workers, its young generation coming into the labor market. I guess that won't matter for a year or two, but the question is, will a country whose economy is 80% reliant on exports avoid a hard landing in a world of reduced demand and minimal trade? Not only will you be disappointed if you're looking to China to provide the engine for global growth, we may even find China collapsing in the foreseeable future. It's a hard thing to say, and I hesitate to say it, but that is actually the nature of the reality of the future of China. I hope it doesn't happen, because if China goes down, obviously a lot of things are going down, and the global economy is not going to be a happy place. Not only that, a collapsing China creates political problems for all its neighbors, including India, no doubt. So it's not something for which any of us should wish, but that is a very real danger facing China, and I feel that, and I'm very much afraid that particularly American analysts and I was talking to one this morning, American top bankers and top people, it doesn't matter if they're social leaders, political leaders, economic leaders, are completely misreading the situation in China. They're looking to China to provide global growth at a time when China is going to face the worst problems it's had in the last 30 years in a whole generation. And it has, for the first time starting this year, an untested leadership team. It's again slightly exaggerated. It's not untested. They've all been part of the kind of ruling elite in China, but they've never been in charge before this. Now they're in charge for the first time. So a team that's new, problems that are new, facing a country that is relatively still new, with a lot of unemployed young people going forward, is not a recipe for happiness in that country, and I suggest it's not a recipe for happiness in the rest of the world if you're looking to China to provide the engine for global growth. So is there hope anywhere? My view is that no country can provide an engine of growth except the United States. As I said in my lecture at the Arizona Council on Economic Education last fall, which was quoted in the kind introduction that Kiran did for me just now, America will not do badly in the foreseeable future, provided your politicians don't upset the apple cart. And of course, provided that no other disaster hits the globe. If it does, if any disaster hits the globe, then expect America's position as a safe haven for global money to be strengthened even more than it is at the moment. So I'm betting on the United States to provide as much of an engine to growth as any country, though it won't be much of an engine, as the US still needs to deleverage, reduce its debt at every level: federal, state, municipal, corporate, family, individual. Debt needs to come down, and it's kind of not coming down that much. You may have noticed that from the February figures, if any of you have been following them, consumers are beginning to spend again in the United States 5 years after the crisis started, even though wages have not really gone up. Which means, of course, the debt is increasing, right? So debt did go down, but it seems to be bouncing up again, and the question is debt going to continue growing? Because if debt continues growing, that's not a very sound basis for growth. And the other bright light on the horizon is India. So I'm going to come to India now. Even though India has not performed up to its potential, like most emerging markets since independence in 1947, the socialist orientation of India's leadership in the first 5 years after independence did provide very sound, solid, good growth for India. But the period after that, so we're talking 1951, 52 sort of onwards, 53 onwards, was a period that's marked by lackadaisical sort of growth, insultingly referred to as a Hindu rate of growth, till the first wave of liberalization took place in the 1990s, when growth took off, hitting nearly 12% at the height of the boom. The promised second wave of reforms has never been delivered, because like the US, India is politically paralyzed. The rate of growth has now fallen to less than 7%. And of course, you can't judge by a quarter or two, but the future prospects don't look very bright. The rupee shed 3.7% in March alone, the worst fall in 4 bad months. So it fell, the previous worst was 6.7% fall in November last year. The total it fell last year was 12.3%. which is not a minor fall. The current account deficit widened from 19.6 billion in the last quarter of the last year to 18.4 billion, from 18.3 billion in quarter 3, or 9.7 billion a year earlier. In other words, compared to a year earlier, it had more than doubled. The fiscal deficit was 94.6% in the period April to February 2011-12, compared to 68.6% for the comparable previous period. The external debt went up to $334.9 billion. That was a 9% increase to December 2011. And the proportion of external debt to GDP, that is the money we owe outside the country to the total amount of money we have in the country, went up to 20% of the total amount of goods and goods and products produced in goods, products and services produced in the country at the end of December 2011 compared to 17.8% at the end of March 2010. The forex reserves, foreign exchange reserves, covered 99.6% of external debt at the start of the financial year 2011, but declined to 88.6% by the end of the third quarter. India's balance of payments was positive 4 billion at the fourth quarter of 2010, but by fourth quarter of 2011, it had shrunk or declined, gone the wrong way, to 12.8 billion. And remember, it was last in the red in the third quarter of December 2008, at the time of the collapse of Lehman Brothers. Foreign exchange funds invested in India were only 8 billion in 2011, compared to 39 billion in 2010. So the question naturally arises, is India too going to face the question of collapse, like, in my view, China is facing the question of collapse? Well, from a purely economic perspective, the answer is no, because China, whose economy is 80% reliant on exports, is in a much worse position than India, where only 60% of the economy is reliant on exports. It's still a lot, but it's not as much as China is. And much of these exports are, of course, IT related, the demand for which is relatively robust, unlike China's exports, which are mostly commodities, products, that sort of thing, for which demand is relatively elastic, which means that demand has shrunk and can shrink further, whereas the demand for India's products has shrunk and will shrink only marginally. In my view, may even grow in spite of the current situation globally. So I don't expect India's growth rate to fall much below the present level. Though, of course, India will have a massive problem as well in coping with the social fallout of the situation where we're not having at least 8% growth, because the problem is essentially the same. If you don't have 8% growth in developing countries with the kind of population profile we have, you cannot employ the next generation of people coming into the labor market. And of course, like China, India has a very high level of corruption, which doesn't make our job easy as a country. Though I should say that China has slightly less corruption than India has, and Chinese corruption is better organized. Because as you know, it's a military-run state. I mean, the People's Army runs everything. Of course, there is an elected government, but that's the Communist Party, and the Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army. I mean, you know, everybody knows how they work together. So it's essentially a military-run state, in spite of the kind of face of democracy that is put on things. But the positive side of it is that they can control corruption if they really wanted to. In India, of course, we have a slightly worse situation in reality in terms of corruption, but that corruption is much more amoebic. It's much more kind of widely spread in society. And it's much more difficult to control. Between the impact of lower growth and the frustrations caused by corruption, one major challenge for India is its Maoist movement, which already controls how much of the country. Maoists, by the way, are what we Indians call Naxalites. So these are extreme Marxists who believe in violence to take over the state. Nobody knows how much of the country they really control. Estimates vary from the most conservative 10% to 25%, which is a kind of median figure, to 40% of the country. And of course, their influence is much wider. How much wider? Nobody knows. Some people complain that 80% of the country is influenced by Maoist thinking. In other words, everywhere outside the big cities. And even in the big cities, the thinking is that there's a lot of Maoist sympathy in the slums and among the poorer people. I don't know if it's true. I'm not really in touch with grassroots realities as they're developing in the country. I'm skeptical of these kind of figures, but I don't know. I mean, I go to India quite often. I was in India 5 times last year. In January alone this year, I was there for 3 weeks. I was in Kerala, I was in Bombay, Hyderabad, Delhi, Bangalore. So, you know, I'm in and out of the country reasonably often, but I'm not in the villages. I'm not speaking, you know, with people on the ground. So I really don't know what the actual figures are. But even if it's only 10% of the country and going up, that's not a situation that should make any Indian or anybody who's interested in India comfortable. Because national elections are coming up in 2014. It's not very far away. And it is unclear whether there'll be a single party with a majority. In fact, all the consensus forecasts say it won't be a single party with a majority. So the political impasse in the country may continue. On the other hand, even a coalition government can, of course, deliver. If it finds the political will, it can find the possibility of delivering the second wave of liberalization. And if that happens, it could unleash a wave of further growth. So my analysis in summary is that India will continue to have 6–7% of growth, might fall a bit lower, but I don't expect it to fall much lower, till 2013 or 14, depending on when exactly the elections are called. And then there will be a stalled to collapsing kind of situation till whenever the second wave of liberalization is delivered. And if it's not delivered in time, then there is a real danger of a Maoist takeover or an eventual breakup of India. So it is imperative for us to take matters seriously in hand. We don't have much time. And not to quarrel internally about whether someone is right-wing or left-wing or intelligent or middling or upper caste or untouchable. I mean, these are idiotic things we should forget about if we want the country to survive and flourish. We need to get on with the job of building the country instead of destroying it. Who is destroying it? Actually, our current elite is destroying our country. How are we destroying it? We're destroying it by corruption on the one hand and by our apathy and our escapism on the other. So India has the potential, has always had the potential, has for a very long time had the potential of becoming a real growth engine for the world, at least a reasonably good growth engine. May not be as good as the United States, but not bad. Second to the United States, India could be the growth engine of the global economy, but we need to get our act together politically, we need to get our act together socially, we need to get our act together educationally. I mean, you know the situation, all of you have been through the Indian education system if you're from India. And those of you who have not been through the education system in India may have learned a bit about it from Indians here. And you know how very highly competitive the situation is. In other words, the supply is just not there. Demand is absolutely huge. It's incredible demand for education and just not enough supply, quality supply. In the college that I went to, we still take 400 students only a year. And for these 400 students, there were 12,000 people competing in 2007. Last year, there were 27,000 people competing for 400 seats. So that's how already huge competition has ramped up just in the last few years, because obviously the demographic profile of India is that age group of Indians is growing in number. Why have wages been rising in the way they have in India? Of course, the IT sector particularly represents this, because there's huge demand in the IT sector for employable people, and we're just not producing enough people who are employable. And the people we do produce are in global demand, so obviously they would rather come and work in the States or in England or Germany or Australia, if they can, than work in India. Except for a few highly patriotic people, and you and I know how many of them there are. So we just need to take ourselves seriously, we need to take our problems seriously, we need to look ourselves in the face and say, what do we really need to do to sort our country out? And education is clearly one of them. And all we've done is come up with this pathetic Right to Education Act, which is just more bureaucratic. It doesn't actually provide anything more on the ground, really. And in fact, it strangles and paralyzes a lot of what is good work that is going on. So we need to get beyond political gimmicks like this and really, put some real money into real education and make sure there are people who are on the ground, who are motivated, who want to teach people, who want to educate people, help people, lift people up from where they are. Until that cultural revolution takes place, and people are not interested only in their own pocket, even if it destroys a country. Till that cultural revolution takes place, moral revolution, spiritual revolution, call it what you will, ethical revolution, call it what you will, till that revolution takes place, we will not see India really beginning to exploit its potential. But if we can't do that, then at least India must take its political challenges seriously, so that by 2014, in 2 years' time, we are not facing the kind of problem that I think we will. In fact, I was surprised we did not face that problem at the last elections. And I think it's really a miracle of God's grace that at the last elections we did not face the kinds of problems that I think we will certainly face in 2014. So India has huge potential, but we need to get our act together in order to realize it. If we do, then of course India will be the second greatest engine of the global economy after the United States, depending on whether we sort out the global rules of the game. And the global rules of the game are, at present, unfairly tilted against the United States as a result of the American elite having betrayed American people. And I say that slightly exaggeratedly, slightly for impact, because of course the American elite knew exactly what it was doing in signing NAFTA and in signing the World Trade Agreement. And what it did in signing those agreements was against, by the way, the manifestos on the basis of which they asked for votes. Contrary to those manifestos, they signed the World Trade Agreement, and before that NAFTA, excluding social and excluding environmental concerns. Now, if you exclude social concerns, human concerns, and you exclude environmental concerns, then there is absolutely no doubt that manufacturing is not going to be in any big, significant way in the United States. It's going to move to countries that do not take care of the environment, that do not provide minimum standards of human care, do not provide a minimum salary, do not provide minimum health regulations and care and all that. Why is it going to go to those countries? Because, of course, labor is cheap. Why is labor cheap? Obviously, they're not being paid properly, they're cheap. So it's clear that manufacturing is not going to be in the United States, manufacturing is going to be in China, India, Vietnam, wherever else. So the hollowing out of the US economy was something that was entirely foreseeable. And what was foreseen is exactly what has happened. And that's one of the reasons why, though the economy in theory bounces back, jobs don't bounce back. And the reason why jobs don't bounce back in the way they should is, of course, because manufacturing is not here. I'm not pretending that manufacturing provides a huge mass of jobs. Today's manufacturing is more and more automated. Nevertheless, in spite of that, it does provide some jobs. And if it provides jobs, then it provides incomes. And if it provides incomes, that enables people with incomes to buy goods and services. And if it enables people to buy goods, they can come from anywhere, but if it enables them to buy services, those services primarily will come from within the United States. Some services you can supply from India or wherever else because they're IT related or finance related, but a lot of the services you have to provide here. Clean streets, bridges that are going to stand up when the wind blows too strong, or traffic goes over them, or care for old people, teaching for young people, children. These kinds of services you can only buy locally. You may import people to do that, that's fine, but you've got to pay for it locally and you've got to provide it locally. So the United States is finding itself in a position where it finds it increasingly difficult to do these basic things until it sorts out World Trade Agreement and things like NAFTA. It will not be able to sort them out. This is not something that either party is taking seriously, and I'm afraid that both parties are completely out of touch with the realities on the ground in the country. So the United States needs to get its act together in terms of providing real global leadership so that we can begin to build the right kind of globalization rather than the wrong kind of globalization, which is what we have at present. And if you're interested in reading an analysis of this, then I suggest you read my chapter in the book called Law and Ethics in a Globalizing Economy, which was the proceedings of the conference by that name, organized by the top research institution in Germany. I can only describe it as that, which is the Max Planck Institute. The solutions to the wrong kind of globalization are known. My solutions are not kind of brand new and plucked out of my head. They come out of a lot of reading and research and thinking. But they are kind of easy to read, which is why I recommend them to you if you're not economists. If you're economists, obviously there are plenty of other places you can go to for more sophisticated and detailed discussions. So just to kind of summarize where we are, I want to say that the only sources of growth that I see midterm, immediately obviously things are different, but midterm over the next 3 to 5, 7, 10 years is the United States and India, if both countries get their act together, particularly if the United States begins to provide the right kind of global leadership to build the right kind of globalization, which it is not doing at the moment. Now I come very briefly to the question, to the topic I promised to come to, what about jobs in this kind of a situation? What kinds of jobs will remain? Global volatility will hit certain kinds of jobs clearly. The global economics will hit certain kinds of jobs. New technology will hit certain kinds of jobs. So what kinds of jobs are going to be there in future? If you are looking for a job now, what sectors should you be looking in? Should you be looking necessarily in your own sectors, which you've got a PhD in or a master's in? Should you be looking in very different sectors? Well, I want to recommend 3 sectors for you to look at, or 3 ways of looking at the global economy in the next 5 to 10 years, which is the kind of time frame you should be thinking of course, if you're going into a career now, at least. And I want to suggest to you that one area to look at is logistics. And the reason to look at logistics is because the whole logistics organization of the global economy is changing as a result of information technology and the impact of new technologies. There were logistical supply chains earlier. They were regionally oriented, they were nationally oriented, they're becoming more and more global, they're becoming more and more IT driven, so the entire logistics chain of the world is changing. Anybody who goes into logistics or a logistics related company, as a finance person, as a lawyer, as a technical person, is going to find that he or she is in a relatively good place for the next 5 or 10 years, maybe longer, maybe much longer, because the whole change that is taking place there. The second area is marketing. And the reason why marketing is still extremely important is because we are in a world of global oversupply for the first time in history. Never before have we been in a place where we can oversupply every single good and every single service. The globalization of banking, which is a world I know quite well, I used to work for a bank, retired last year. The globalization of banking means we have too many banks. Worldwide, we have too many banks in every country, we have too many banks in every region, we have too many banks in every state, we have too many banks in every locality. We just have too many banks. And there's going to be a consolidation of the banking industry. But what does that mean? It means that every bank is in mortal combat with every other single bank. Because the question is, which bank is going to survive and which bank is going to take over which other bank? And that's not true only for banking, that's true for every industry. You can look at the pharma industry, you can look at the car industry, you can look at the whatever industry you can look at. There is competition in every industry such as we've never seen before in history. Well, that's slightly untrue. In the period 1870 to 1890, up to sort of the First World War, we also had a situation of global oversupply of products. But that was not in everything. Now we have it in everything, whether it's beer, whether it's potatoes, whether it's computer chips or potato chips, doesn't matter. Whether it's aluminium production, whatever field. I guess the only field where we don't have overproduction is nuclear plants, and we can have our own opinions about whether nuclear plants are a good thing or a bad thing and how many we need and all the rest of it. But we don't have too many nuclear physicists around, right? Worldwide, we have a shortage of nuclear physicists. And there are 1 or 2 fields like this where we don't have enough, but otherwise there's an oversupply of everything. And that's why marketing is important. Because who wins in the marketplace? He or she or the company that markets better, right? Of course, distributes better, has the right price and all the rest of it. But that's all related to marketing. It's also related to strategy, of course. You can argue these things in circles. But if you're in marketing, you're in a good place. So logistics is one field. If you can get into it, great. Or get into a logistics company if you can't get into logistics because you're not a logistics man or woman. Get into marketing. You may not be a marketing good man or woman. You work for a marketing company, you're in a good place. Whether you work as an accountant, a lawyer, a design person, or IT person, or whatever, you're in a good place. And the third area to get into, in my view, the third best area to get into, there may be other areas that are good, but at least the third best area is innovation. And innovation can be in the area of products. Innovation can be in the area of services. And innovation can be in the area of culture. I mean culture in the broad sense, music, art, painting, literature, all that sort of stuff. Because, of course, the middle is being hollowed out of all these things. So if you're kind of only averagely good, you can forget it. But if you're kind of locally good, you may do very well because of local factors. Otherwise, you've got to be kind of number 1, number 2, number 3 in the world. And then, of course, you can mint as much money as you want. Today, it almost doesn't matter which profession you go into. If you're the world's number 1 car racer, I mean, how much intelligence do you need to be a car racer? Not the same as a nuclear physicist, right? Different kind of intelligence, yeah, but not the same. And not at the same level. You can make as much money, maybe many times more than a nuclear physicist. You can be a top banker, you may not earn as much as a top chef. If you're the world's top chef, you can make a huge amount of money. So today it doesn't matter which profession you go into. If you're the world number 1, 2, or 3 singing, how much money do singers make? But if you're the world's top opera singer, no shortage of money for you, right? Or classical singer, or whatever. So it doesn't matter which profession you're in. If you're in the number 1, 2, 3 position, you'll do okay. So in the innovation kind of area, you've got to be kind of number 1, 2, 3, worldwide, nationwide, or something like that. But if you're that, you're fine. So I recommend to you these 3 areas to get into in terms of jobs. May not be your field, but get into companies in these fields and you'll do okay. Logistics, marketing, and innovation. I'll stop there and maybe there's time for questions and then I'll make a quick concluding statement, if that's all right. Okay? Thank you very much. Now there are questions. I could see one hand at the back there, and I could see, is that you, Mr. Dan, you had your hand up earlier, or? No, you did not. Okay, there's a hand up there, and there's a hand up there, so please. Give us your name, tell us, sort of like half a sentence about yourself, PhD candidate, or vice president of, or job seeker, or whatever. Sorry, I can't hear you. You have to hold it right up.
My name is Bhushan.
Bhushan.
I work for industry. And the question I had was, so we talked a little bit about China, India, and defense, and all of that. So in the past couple of years, China has been very aggressive in terms of securing energy resources around the world, right? And according to my correction is the second problem with the first inflation.
Sorry, the first is?
First is inflation.
Inflation.
So
Yeah.
my question is, what is India doing to achieve its energy independence when everyone is competing for
Yeah.
resources?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, inflation is a very big issue. Energy dependence is a very big issue, and the question is whether we have a national energy policy which makes sense, and whether we are willing to tackle the uncomfortable political realities of how to sort it out. If 40% roughly, different estimates are there about how much of the energy that we do produce is stolen or not paid for, if you want to be very polite about it. If 40% of what we produce is just disappearing, then we need to do something about it. But the trouble is, the guys who do it are in cahoots with local mafias, are in cahoots with the local administration, are in cahoots with local lawyers, so it's very difficult to get at these things. Now, unless there's a national commitment, a national change of will to address these kind of issues, we will not be able to address any of them. Inflation is a kind of technical matter. You can get at that to a certain extent. But energy dependence is the only long-term way of sorting it out, is to get our own act together in terms of the investments that are needed in solar, in wind, and all the other complementary forms of energy that we can get, which may end up being 10%, 15%, I don't know, of the total energy supply in the country. And then look to conventional sources, gas, oil, nuclear, whatever, to get ourselves up to where we should be. But the difficulty with all these things is, if you want to build a nuclear plant in India as a commercial company, you get tangled with what? Land acquisition. You want to start a car factory, what do you get tangled with? Land acquisition. You get tangled with permits. Immediately you're in trouble with the local bureaucrats whom you need to bribe and all the rest of it. So our progress is not stopped because we are stupid people. We are highly intelligent, highly clever people. We come from India to the United States, we do very well. We come from India to Australia or Germany or England or wherever, we do very well. So it's not that Indians are stupid, but we have somehow created a national system which is highly stupid. And this national system that we've created is our own fault. We keep blaming the British. The British left 60 years ago, for goodness sake. 2 generations of Indians have been in power and have been and gone. If you take 30 years as a kind of average lifespan of an Indian in some kind of position of power or influence, 2 generations have come and gone. And what has happened, we haven't really made the kind of progress we could have done. Of course, we've done many things. If you look at our life expectancy, it's gone up. If you look at our illiteracy level, it's reduced. If you look at our roads, they've improved. If you look at our cities, they've improved. Of course, we've done a lot. But we haven't done anything like we could have done, and nothing like we should be able to do. And I think we've come to a kind of crisis point politically. And whether it's inflation, whether it's energy dependence, whether it's sorting out the problem of Maoism, whichever of these issues it is, we just need to get our thinking together. We need to make sure that there are people who are not just intelligent. All our leaders are intelligent. Okay? Lalu Yadav is a highly intelligent man. You know, we all like to laugh at him and make jokes and all the rest of it. He's a highly intelligent man. And in both parties, both the national parties and all the regional parties, I'm convinced they're highly intelligent people. I'm not saying everybody's highly intelligent, but we have plenty of highly intelligent people in top positions in leadership. But the problem is they're too busy doing things that are for their own benefit eventually, and not for the nation's benefit eventually. We have muscle politics, we have caste politics, we have, you know, politics for all kinds of other reasons, but not politics of national development. And it's not till we get a politics that is oriented to national development that we will get this. I'll give you a very simple instance. There is a particular part of infrastructure, I will not name what part because I don't want to malign particular individuals, okay? I don't believe in maligning particular individuals. But there's a particular part of infrastructure which required, at that stage about 2 years ago, $5 billion as investment in order to get that particular kind of infrastructure in the country up to scratch. Now, $5 billion is a lot of money. And instead of doing the rational thing, and the rational thing would have been to call for a global tender and say, we would like to have $5 billion invested in this country. Who would like to offer us $5 billion on what terms and conditions? Okay? Simple process. We do this all the time for all kinds of things. Okay? Instead of doing that, what happened? The department secretary, this is the top civil official in this particular part of the infrastructure, and the minister concerned, both went on a global foxtrot. It's not the right word, global jamboree, so that they could go from place to place to place, meeting potential investors in order to interest them in investing in India. And I was so horrified. The man concerned, the top civil servant, is somebody I knew at college, right? So I was able to talk to him face to face and say, you know, are you really being responsible? Why are you wasting national money going on a junket all around the world? When all you need to do is write emails, letters to one person if you want one bank to bid for it, to 10 people if you want 10 banks to bid for it, to 100 people if you want 100 banks to bid for it, and they will spend their money and fly to you to present to you their plan of what they want to invest in. What are we doing instead? We're wasting our money. And even more important, I would say, than the money is the minister's time. Does he not have better things to do? Is the civil servant's time, does he not have better things to do? Is India so comfortably off that our best civil servant in that field can go swanning around the world, staying in 5-star hotels, and talking to people he doesn't need to talk to, some of the time, so that he can go shopping with his wife the rest of the time? This is the way in which we destroy our country. So that's what we need to change. I'm sorry for a long answer, but I'm quite, emotional about these things. There was another question there. Vikram, I think, was wanting to speak. I think we should wrap up in about 5 minutes. Is that right? And there's a question here. So after that, you'll need to run over here. Question, please, Vikram, or comment, or joke, or story, whatever.
It's a question, Director.
Please.
My name is Vikram, and I'm a student in the University of Houston.
Sure.
And I really get confused when they talk about growth indices.
I'm sorry, when they talk about?
Growth index.
Gold index.
So we have GDP, the absolute number, and then there is GDP growth rate,
Yeah.
and the PPP. Now, the growth rate and the PPP put India in a brighter light, and the absolute number puts USA in a brighter light. So which is true?
Well, the fact of the matter is neither is true, in the sense that it depends on the reliability of the figures to begin with. And it depends on how you interpret them. So what is PPP, and what basis are you taking PPP, and what is a base, and you can always argue about these things. So economists will carry on arguing about these kind of things forever. We're very sophisticated, we're very intelligent, we can argue one way or the other way about these things. But if you go to India and you look at what's happened in India, I was born there, I grew up there, so I see what happened in my lifespan, which is now 63. So over 60 odd years, from the time I became conscious, so to speak, I've seen the changes in India, and the changes are huge. I mean, we don't have the number of beggars we did. We don't have people walking around barefoot. We don't have people in flimsy and torn clothes. I mean, I'm not saying that everybody's wearing, branded goods. No, I'm not saying that. But the actual material level of the poorest in India has improved enormously. But the difficulty is that the expectations of the poorest in India have also gone up exponentially. And the reason they've gone up exponentially is because we don't live in an isolated world anymore. We live in a world where everybody can see what everybody's eating, what everybody's drinking, what everybody's wearing, what everybody's going, what kind of sports they have, what kind of hobbies they have. It's all clear on television. Every single village in India has television. So naturally, expectations are huge. This doesn't mean everybody wants to sit where Ambani is sitting. But this means everybody wants to have a better quality of life than they do have at the moment. If they don't have a bike, they would like to have a bike. If they have a bike, they'd like to have a scooter. If they have a scooter, they'd like to have a car. Now we can argue, are these really good things, and do we really want everybody to have a car? We can argue about these things. But the fact is they would like to have a little better standard of living. And when we say little, that little has gone up from what it was 60 years ago. Because the amount that would satisfy a poor person 60 years ago is not the amount that would satisfy a poor person today. So all the growth that we have been able to supply is growth that is good and great. We've done wonderfully well from some points of view. But the expectations that we've created in a very large number of people, growing population, are much huger than we've been able to satisfy. And the difficulty is when you read our national papers, what are we busy with? We're looking at cricket scores, and we're looking at whether the actress X or Y or Z, is marrying somebody or not marrying somebody, how deep her cleavage is, and idiotic things like this is what the national papers are concerned about. When our media wakes up and says, let's start taking national issues seriously, and when our politicians wake up and say, let's start taking our national issues seriously, that's when there's going to be real progress, more than the kind of 5, 6, 7% growth that we have at the moment foreseeable. But if we do get our act together, we could easily have 11%, 12% growth. So if you look at the absolute achievement we've done, we can say we haven't done badly. But if you look at the potential for what we could do, we've done terribly. And the difficulty is that because of this discontent, there is a rising mass of people, some of whom are educated, not all of them are educated, but some of them are educated. And in the old days, you did not have educated people, and if you had educated people from this kind of background, they were still under the dominance of our culture, which meant, they didn't feel they could or should rock the boat. But that's all gone. The new generation of people has no qualms about rocking the boat. And unfortunately, the rocking of the boat gets bigger and more violent and more difficult to handle, and that's what represents the danger. So those are the things that I'm concerned about when I look at India. But I say these things because we are talking about India, and most of us in the room are Indians, so we should be concerned about these things and thinking about them. But I'm not pessimistic about India. I'm most optimistic about India, number 2, to America, for the reasons that I've mentioned.